All right, they grab your attention at the grocery store, but some of them stay part of our history for years. It is the magazine covers that draw you in.
And a new book is explaining just that. Iconic magazine covers, the inside stories told by the people who made them. Takes readers behind the scenes into the front pages that made history. So joining us now is the author of that book, Birch, also with a bit of an accent.
Good
this
to
is
see
an
you.
accent block here. So this is such a great idea for a book. As soon as I heard what it was about, immediately my mind started sort of going through a list of covers and everything. And I thought to myself, how do you whittle the right book, the right covers down? This must have been so difficult for you to do.
It was very, very difficult. It was kind of a nightmare, but it was a kind of enjoyable nightmare, if I can say that.
The best kinds, yes.
I mean, basically, it boiled down to the fact that I've worked in magazines now for about 30 years. And I've built my own archive throughout the years. I've been very lucky to have worked in America and Britain and Australia and France and Italy. So I've sort of over the years built up my own little archive, and I suddenly thought, why don't I do something with this archive? Because it's just sitting there in the attic, getting dustier and dustier. And I pulled them out and I started thinking, well, why not do something on covers? Because the cover is the most important page in a magazine.
Yeah.
So let's look at this, and let's also talk to the people who created the covers, because I don't think that's been done before.
The story behind the cover.
Story behind the covers.
So I know we'll talk about some of the ones that we selected for the segment, but I think Anne-Marie also has a couple that she wants to talk about, like what's not included, or at least why.
No,
you don't?
We're going to start with, by the way.
No, I said we will do that after.
So listen, now let's
Sorry, I have, to me, the greatest cover in magazine history is one of the ones that you have in this book, which is the Esquire magazine cover of Muhammad Ali in St. Sebastian form.
Yes.
And the reason why I think it's so interesting is because this magazine cover, to me, represents the crossroads that this country was in at that period in the 1960s around race, around religion, around sports. This is a man who was heavyweight champion of the world, but he had changed his religion.
Correct.
That made him already suspicious. He's already outspoken and loudmouthed, right, to a lot of people in this country. Now he's changed his religion to one that most people don't understand. What was George Lois, the art director for Esquire, what was his idea for this cover?
Basically, George Lois was actually quite a good friend of Muhammad Ali's.
Is that right?
Yeah, and he's a big boxing fan, so they knew each other beforehand. George Lois, as you may know, is probably one of the greatest art directors in the 60s.
Yeah, he's the model of Don Draper, I'm told. Right? That's what they'd modeled Don Draper.
I'm sure he'd be thrilled to hear that. Yeah. But he saw Muhammad Ali, and as you rightly said, in 1967 he converted to Islam. When he was drafted, he refused to go as a conscientious objector because his religion wouldn't allow that. He was then stripped of his title. He was then, a federal jury said he had to go to prison for 5 years. So George Lois saw Ali as a martyr for his religion. He saw a painting in the Met of San Sebastian being pierced by 6 arrows, and he thought that that would be the model for this cover. And so that's why there are 6 arrows coming out. And what's interesting is that there's a funny story behind it, because the arrows were actually pasted on, but the paste wasn't strong enough to hold the arrow. So the arrow kept sagging because they'd been specially made, so they were quite heavy. So Carl Fisher, who was the photographer, suddenly had to think of a way of making this work. So he got fishing wire and he stretched it across the ceiling and then dropped down filaments to hold the arrow up.
Wow.
So that's why it worked in the end, and they had to kind of touch out, as in the retoucher for the photograph.
That's very cool.
The wires. And I interviewed Carl Fisher for the book, and he said that Muhammad Ali was the most gracious celebrity he'd ever come across, because he had to stand there for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, while they tried to get these arrows in position.
That's amazing.
Man of the people.
Can we talk about the July 65 Cosmo cover?
Yes.
You know, I think people who are familiar with Cosmo now, you know, see this sort of like girly magazine, Kama Sutra for the modern girl, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, really?
But it was really sort of an iconic magazine.
Yes.
And broke a lot of rules and discussed things that women weren't allowed to discuss in public.
Yes. Yes, and it was probably the most successful women's magazine in the history of publishing. So Helen Gurley Brown, the very legendary Helen Gurley Brown, as I'm sure you know, had already written Sex and the Single Girl that had become a publishing phenomenon. And she decided she wanted to kind of expand this franchise to make movies and TV programs and so on. And she thought, well, the logical extension is to edit a magazine. Hearst, who own Cosmo, thought they might approach her to see if she'd be interested, because they were looking for a savior, literally a savior for the magazine, because it was falling off a cliff in terms of sales and so on. So they asked Helen to come in and change it, and that was her first cover. And already you can see the new Cosmo emerging, you know, the kind of cover lines. She was obsessed with her reader. She wanted to understand and help her reader in every possible way. And I think what was interesting is that it immediately sold out. That was what was so extraordinary.
Cosmo's still going.
It is still going. The other one that is probably one of the most controversial magazine covers in the history of magazines is National Lampoon. Let's put this up, because I don't know if young people will have seen this magazine. I remember as a young kid seeing this and thinking to myself, what is this magazine about? Who is National Lampoon? What is National Lampoon? So there's a picture there of a dog with a gun to its head, and if you can't see it, it says, if you don't buy this magazine, we will kill this dog. And there's a really interesting story as to why they took this desperate measure, which probably would not be allowed today, but this was the 70s.
I don't think it would be allowed today. So basically, as I'm sure you know, National Lampoon was the kind of incarnation of hip in campuses in the early 70s. Had a huge student readership, and they loved this kind of humor. This idea actually was dreamed up by a guy called Ed Bluestone, who was one of the contributors. And it began actually as a subscription campaign. So it was basically, if you don't buy a subscription to this magazine, we'll kill the dog. And if you don't do that, we'll kill the cat. And if you don't do that, the animal death toll will be so huge that you will feel, you know, forever awful.
And of course, people felt obligated to buy the magazine.
Absolutely.
And it worked. It worked.
So they had decided to do a death-themed issue. So this was the perfect idea, because obviously they didn't use it for the subscription drive. And they did it, and the great story behind it is they found a dog, but the dog wouldn't react because it kept looking at the photographer, as a dog would, you know, because the photographer was calling the dog. So the dog looked at the photographer. And at the very last moment, somebody had the bright idea of getting a toy gun, cocking it, and then, you know, letting it go. So of course the dog heard the noise
and turned and looked, because the eyes.
That's perfect.
And they captured that moment.
Right. And that was it.
It's
the only
possibly
one.
The only one.
Right.
The one moment that was the perfect moment.
So listen, I know you mentioned how difficult it was to whittle everything down. Did you have other restrictions? I mean, you had to ask permission to use these covers, right?
Yeah, it was actually very complicated and quite expensive. It took us almost over a year to get clearances, rights, permissions to run the covers. We had to pay in certain cases because sadly the magazine industry is not as economically vibrant as it used to be. And one of the ways that magazine companies now are trying to find extra revenue is by charging you for using their magazines. So we had to spend a lot of time and a significant amount of money to actually be allowed to run these in the magazine.
Okay, Ian, we feel bad enough. We'll buy the book.
But they're
my sob story.
I mean, it's not as good as a dog, but it'll work.
People should really pick up this book, because there's so many other things that we were not able to touch on. You know, there's magazine covers that talked about homosexuality, about race. I think Beverly Johnson, the first African-American model, is. I thought I saw you flipping.
Yeah, she's in there.
She's in there.
The Afghan girl of National Geographic,
which is one of the most striking images
Fabulous
ever.
image.
So if people are interested in sort of the history of this country and the world through the lens of fashion or magazine covers, this is the book to buy.
Thank you
Ian.
very much.
Thank you, Ian.
I appreciate it.